What happens when your family calls you a failure? Your entire life then accidentally books their anniversary dinner at the restaurant you secretly own. My parents had no idea the aimless son they were ashamed of was about to serve them the most expensive meal of their lives. This is that story. They called me aimless. Tonight, they'll call me co-owner. You know that feeling when your own family looks at you like you're some kind of puzzle they can't figure out, like you're speaking a different language, living in a different world. That was my life for 26 years. I'm standing here in front of Beryl and Vine, straightening this vintage leather jacket that cost more than my dad's monthly car payment. But he doesn't know that. None of them do. See, while my siblings were climbing corporate ladders and collecting degrees like trophies, I was learning something they'd never understand. I was learning that success doesn't always wear a suit. Tonight's different, though. Tonight, my parents are celebrating their 30th anniversary, and they chose this place. My place. They have no idea what they've walked into. For years, I've been the disappointment, the one who dropped out of engineering school, the one who wasted their potential working with barrels and wine instead of spreadsheets and boardrooms. But here's what they never understood about being aimless. Sometimes you have to wander off the beaten path to find where you actually belong. And sometimes the people who call you lost are the ones who've never had the courage to find their own way. 3 years ago, I was broke sleeping on a friend's couch and questioning everything. Tonight, I'm about to show them exactly what aimless looks like when it finds its aim. Let me take you back to where it all started. Picture this Westchester County, New York. Manicured lawns that looked like golf courses, driveways that could fit 3 cars, and families that looked perfect on Christmas cards. My parents, David and Margaret Harper, they had it all figured out. Or so they thought. Dad was a senior partner at Morrison Klein and Associates, the kind of law firm where they serve scotch that costs more than most people's rent. Mom ran charity galas like military operations, the type of woman who could organize 500 people for dinner and make it look effortless. They lived in a world where success was measured by the size of your office, the weight of your business card, and how many zeros were in your annual bonus. Everything had a plan, a trajectory, a proper timeline. Then there was me, their youngest. While my sister Avery was getting early admission to Princeton with a full academic scholarship, and my brother Cole was already interning at Goldman Sachs as a high school senior, I was in the garage completely absorbed in restoring an old wine barrel I'd found at a flea market in Cold Spring. I remember that barrel like it was yesterday. French oak, probably 50 years old, with staves that had been warped by time and neglect. Most people would have seen firewood. I saw potential. I saw craftsmanship that deserved to be honored, restored, given new life. I spent weeks researching techniques online, learning about coopering, understanding how each piece of wood contributed to the barrel's integrity. I taught myself to sand with the grain, to respect the natural curves that decades of wine had carved into the oak. My parents would walk through the garage and see me covered in sawdust, completely lost in my work, and I could feel their disappointment radiating off them like heat. Riley's going through a phase, I'd hear my mother tell her friends on the phone. You know how creative kids can be. We're sure he'll find his focus soon. A phase. That's what they called the first time in my life I'd felt truly passionate about something. I remember the day everything changed. I was 17, carefully applying a wood conditioner to the barrel's interior, lost in the smell of aged oak and the satisfaction of seeing something beautiful emerge from neglect. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the garage windows, and I was completely in my element. That's when my parents walked in with my guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson. They'd been having one of those meetings about my future, about college applications and career paths and all the things that apparently mattered more than what actually made me happy. My dad looked at that barrel like it was evidence of some terrible crime I'd committed. His face went through this progression of emotions, confusion, disappointment, and then something that looked like genuine concern for my mental health. Riley, he said, his voice carrying that tone that made my stomach drop and my shoulders tense, "You're wasting your brain on this nonsense." My mom just shook her head, doing that thing she does when she's trying to look supportive while actually being critical. "Honey, we didn't raise you to be a carpenter. You're supposed to be studying for your SATs. Your siblings didn't get into Ivy League schools by playing with wood in the garage. Mrs. Peterson tried to be diplomatic. Riley has excellent grades, she said, but we're concerned about channeling his energy into pursuits that will serve his future. But here's what none of them understood. When I touched that wood, when I understood how it had been shaped and aged and prepared to hold something precious, when I could feel the history in every grain and imagine the wine that would someday age within those staves, I felt more alive than I ever did, sitting in advanced calculus or AP physics. This wasn't just about the barrel. This was about understanding that things could be beautiful and functional at the same time. That there was value in craftsmanship, in taking time to do something right, instead of just fast. They made me throw the barrel away. I watched from my bedroom window as the garbage truck took it away, and something inside me broke that day. It wasn't just about losing the project. It was about realizing that the people who were supposed to support my dreams were the same people who couldn't see value in anything that didn't fit their predetermined definition of success. So I did what any good kid does when faced with that kind of pressure. I gave them what they wanted. I applied to engineering schools, wrote essays about wanting to build bridges and design sustainable infrastructure. I got into a decent program at Syracuse, packed my bags, and headed off to become the person they thought I should be. But here's the thing about passion. You can bury it, ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist, but you can't kill it. It sits there in your chest, like a seed, waiting for the right conditions to grow. While my roommates were playing video games and joining fraternities, and doing all the normal college things, I was in the basement of my dorm, running secret experiments that would have made my parents question my sanity all over again. I'd managed to get my hands on small oak samples from a lumberyard in Syracuse. I was learning about different wood types, how American oak differed from French oak, how the char level affected flavor profiles. I was fermenting grape juice in mason jars, hidden behind textbooks, trying to understand the science behind something that felt like magic. My parents thought I was finally on the right track. Dean's List every semester engineering scholarship that covered half my tuition summer internships at respectable firms where I wore suits and attended meetings about infrastructure projects. They'd brag about me at dinner parties, tell their friends how their youngest had finally found direction and was applying himself to something meaningful. If only they knew that every night after studying thermodynamics and structural engineering, I was building something they'd never approve of. Every late night in that basement, every weekend spent reading about viticulture and fermentation, every dollar I spent on wine books instead of textbooks, I was becoming someone they'd never understand. And the crazy part, I was getting good at it. Really good. My grape juice experiments were turning into actual wine. My understanding of oak aging was becoming sophisticated enough that I could taste the difference between wood from different regions, different char levels, different aging periods. I started reaching out to local wineries, volunteering during harvest season, learning from people who'd been doing this their whole lives. I told my parents I was doing research for engineering projects, studying fluid dynamics and fermentation science for academic credit. Technically, it wasn't a lie. I was studying fermentation science. I just wasn't mentioning that it had nothing to do with my degree. Then something happened that changed the entire trajectory of my life. Sophomore year, there was this wine expo in Manhattan, the International Wine and Food Festival, a massive event where artisans and vintners from around the world showcased their work. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was supposed to be spending that Saturday studying for my thermodynamics midterm, the kind of exam that could make or break my GPA. But I'd been following this event online for months, reading about the master sommeliers, who would be there, the rare wines that would be featured. I made a decision that probably saved my life. I skipped the study session and took the train into the city. I brought one of my oak samples with me, a small piece I'd been aging in my dorm room for 6 months, infused with a wine blend I'd been experimenting with. It was probably crazy bringing amateur work to a professional event, but I figured worst case scenario I'd learn something. Best case, maybe someone would tell me I wasn't completely insane for believing I could make something good. The expo was overwhelming. Hundreds of booths, thousands of people who clearly knew more about wine than I'd ever know, the kind of sophistication that made my college experiments feel embarrassingly amateur. That's when I saw him, Julian Moreau. I'd read about him in wine magazines, seen him featured in documentaries about French viticulture. Master Sommelier from Bordeaux, third-generation vintner, the kind of person who could taste a wine and tell you not just what vineyard it came from, but what side of the hill the grapes grew on and what the weather was like during harvest. He was surrounded by people at his booth, all of them hanging on his every word, as he explained the terroir of different Bordeaux regions. I stood at the edge of the crowd for probably an hour trying to work up the courage to approach, knowing I had absolutely no business talking to someone of his caliber. Most of the crowd eventually dispersed, and I found myself standing there alone, still clutching my pathetic little oak sample, still trying to convince myself to walk away before I embarrassed myself. That's when he noticed me. "You look like someone with a question," he said in this accent that made everything sound important, elegant, like even casual conversation was somehow profound. My hands were literally shaking as I pulled out my oak sample. "I've been working on this flavor profile," I said, my voice coming out way higher than normal. "I know it's probably nothing, but I was wondering if you could maybe—" I couldn't even finish the sentence. Here I was, a 19-year-old engineering student asking a master sommelier to evaluate work I'd done in a dorm room basement. But Julien took that piece of wood from my trembling hands like it was something precious. He held it up to the light, examining the grain, then brought it close to his nose and inhaled deeply. His expression changed completely. The polite interest transformed into something more focused, more intense. He looked at the wood, then at me, then back at the wood like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Where did you learn this technique?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that made my heart start racing. I taught myself," I admitted, waiting for him to laugh or dismiss me or tell me to stop wasting his time. Instead, he set the wood down very carefully and reached for the small bottle of wine I'd brought. I watched his face as he tasted it, saw him close his eyes, and really concentrate on what he was experiencing. When he opened his eyes, he was looking at me like I was some kind of mystery he needed to understand. "A young man," he said, setting down the glass with the kind of precision that suggested this was a significant moment. "You have a gift. A gift. When was the last time someone in my family had said those words to me? When was the last time anyone had looked at something I'd created and seen potential instead of problems? This oak treatment," he continued, "it's sophisticated, intuitive. Most people spend years learning to develop this kind of sensitivity to wood and wine interaction." I just stood there, completely speechless, not sure if I was dreaming or if this conversation was actually happening. "I'm hosting a summer program in Bordeaux," he said, pulling out a business card that felt heavier than it should have. "For serious students of viticulture. The application deadline was months ago, but for you, I would make an exception." I stared at that card like it was some kind of magical artifact. Julien Moreau was inviting me to France. Me, the family disappointment who spent his nights in a basement with mason jars and wood samples. "I can't," I said automatically, the words coming out before I could stop them. "I have summer internships lined up. My parents, they expect me to gain professional experience in engineering. They've already made arrangements." Julian smiled, and there was something in that smile that suggested he understood family pressure better than I might expect. "Your parents expect you to waste what you have been given," he asked gently. That would be the real tragedy here. I took his card, knowing that holding it was probably going to change everything, and not sure if I was brave enough for that kind of change. That night, I called my parents from my dorm room, told them about the opportunity, about meeting Julien, about the possibility of spending the summer in France learning about winemaking. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought they'd hung up. Winemaking, my dad finally said, his voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment I'd learned to dread. Riley, this is exactly the kind of distraction that's going to derail your future. You have a summer internship at Morrison & Associates lined up. Real engineering experience that will look good on your resume. Mom tried to be supportive in her way, the way she always did when she was trying to be encouraging while actually being discouraging. Honey, it sounds lovely, really it does. I'm sure France would be educational, but you have responsibilities here. The engineering internship is a real opportunity to learn from professionals, to build connections that will serve your career. But what if this is my career? I asked, the words coming out before I could stop them. Another silence, then my dad's voice colder than I'd ever heard it. Riley, you're 19 years old. You don't know what you want yet. Don't throw away your education for some fantasy about becoming a winemaker. That word, fantasy, like everything I was passionate about was just elaborate make-believe that I'd eventually grow out of. So I made a choice. For the first time in my life, I chose myself over their expectations. I chose the unknown over the safe path. I chose passion over practicality. I called Julien the next morning and accepted his invitation. That summer in Bordeaux changed everything about who I thought I could become. Julien didn't just teach me about wine. He taught me about patience, about understanding that the best things in life can't be rushed or forced or engineered into existence. He showed me how oak aging isn't just a process, it's an art form, how the relationship between wood and wine is something you feel as much as understand, how terroir isn't just about soil and climate, but about tradition and respect and the accumulated wisdom of generations. I worked alongside vintners who had been perfecting their craft since before I was born. I learned about pruning vines and reading weather patterns and understanding that winemaking is as much about intuition as it is about science. But more than the technical knowledge Julien gave me, something my family never had belief. When I doubted myself when I called home and heard the barely concealed disappointment in my parents' voices, when I wondered if I was making the biggest mistake of my life, he reminded me that talent isn't something you apologize for. You have an intuitive understanding of flavor that cannot be taught, he told me one evening, as we sat in his vineyard watching the sunset paint the sky purple over rows of perfect vines. Most people spend decades trying to develop what you have naturally. That is not something to waste on other people's expectations. I learned about different grape varieties, about how Cabernet Sauvignon differs from Merlot, how Pinot Noir requires completely different handling than Syrah. I understood that wine isn't just about alcohol and flavor. It's about story and place and the hundreds of decisions that go into every bottle. By the end of that summer, Julien made me an offer that sounded impossible. He was planning to open a boutique wine bar in New York, something intimate and authentic, focused on small producers and unique pairings. He wanted a partner, someone who understood both the craft and the business side, someone who could help him create something special. I've been doing this for 30 years, he said as we walked through his cellar on my last day. I can teach anyone the technical aspects of wine service, the proper temperatures, the standard pairings. But vision instinct, the ability to understand what makes an experience memorable, that's what you bring to this partnership. I went back to school that fall, but everything had changed. I was counting down the days until I could drop out, until I could start building something real with Julien. Every engineering class felt like time stolen from my actual future. My family thought I'd lost my mind. When I told them I was leaving Syracuse to open a wine bar with Julien, the silence on the phone lasted so long I started checking to see if the call had dropped. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," my dad finally said, his voice carrying the weight of every disappointment he'd ever felt about my choices. "You're throwing away your education, your future, your potential for some fantasy about becoming a restaurateur." "It's not a fantasy," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. This is real. Julian is real. The opportunity is real. Riley, my mom said, her voice breaking slightly. We love you. We want the best for you. But this isn't what we planned. And that's when I understood the fundamental difference between us. They had planned my life. I was finally ready to live it. The next 3 years were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. Julian and I spent months looking for the perfect space, walking through dozens of potential locations, trying to find something that had the right energy, the right bones for what we wanted to create. We finally found it in the West Village, a former antique shop with exposed brick walls, original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, and just enough space for an intimate wine bar that could seat 40 people without feeling crowded. But finding the space was just the beginning. The real work was turning it into something special. We spent months sourcing wines from small vineyards that most people had never heard of. I traveled to Oregon tasting Pinot Noirs from producers who made maybe 300 cases a year. I went to California to tiny family operations in Paso Robles and Mendocino, learning about people who chose quality over quantity, who were doing things the hard way, because it was the right way. I even went back to France with Julien, visiting vineyards that had been in families for generations, tasting wines that told stories about specific pieces of land, specific years, specific decisions made by people who understood that wine isn't just a product, it's a form of communication. But the real magic happened with the barrels. Every piece of oak that would touch our wine, I restored by hand. Some of these barrels were over 100 years old, and each one had its own character, its own history, its own way of influencing whatever aged inside it. I learned to read wood the way other people read books. I could tell you where an oak tree grew by the density of its grain, could predict how it would affect wine by the way it felt under my hands. Each barrel restoration was like solving a puzzle, understanding what it had been, and imagining what it could become. Julian taught me the business side, but I was developing something he couldn't teach my own vision for what barrel and vine could become. I understood our clientele before we even opened, knew we needed to create a space for people who appreciated authenticity over flashiness, who wanted to discover something new instead of ordering something familiar. Our opening night was terrifying and perfect. We invited 50 people, food writers, wine enthusiasts, industry professionals who could make or break us with a single review. I remember standing behind the bar, watching people taste our wines, wondering if we'd created something special, or just another restaurant that would close within a year. But something magical happened that night. People didn't just drink our wine, they experienced it. They asked questions about the vineyards, about the aging process, about the stories behind each bottle. They understood that we weren't just serving alcohol, we were curating experiences. Word spread slowly, but steadily. Food and Wine mentioned us in an article about emerging wine bars. A critic from New York Magazine wrote about our intuitive approach to pairing and our commitment to authentic craftsmanship. The Times featured us in their weekend dining section, calling us a hidden gem for serious wine lovers. But it wasn't just the press. Our regular customers became our best advocates. They brought friends, celebrated anniversaries with us, proposed marriage at our corner table by the window. We became part of people's lives, part of their special moments. 18 months in Julian came to me with a conversation I never saw coming. Riley, he said as we were closing up one Tuesday night, I think it's time for me to step back. My heart dropped. I thought something was wrong, that I disappointed him. Somehow, made some terrible mistake that was going to cost us everything we'd built. You don't understand, he continued, seeing the panic in my face and smiling that gentle smile he got when he was about to teach me something important. You've grown beyond what I can teach you. This place, it's become something more than I ever imagined when we started. It's become yours. He offered to sell me his share of the business. Not because he had to, not because there was any problem, but because he believed in what I was building, because he could see I was ready to take full ownership of the vision we'd created together. I will stay on as sommelier, he assured me. This is still my home, but the decisions, the direction, the future of Barrel and Vine, that should be yours now. I used every penny I had saved, took out loans that kept me awake at night, called in favors I'd been saving for emergencies. At 24 years old, I became the majority owner of Barrel and Vine. The responsibility was overwhelming and exhilarating. Every wine selection, every menu change, every hiring decision was mine now. I was building something that was entirely my own, making choices that reflected my taste, my values, my understanding of what hospitality should feel like. The success was quiet, but undeniable. We weren't making headlines every week, but we were making a profit. Our reservation book was full weeks in advance. Food Network featured us in a segment about innovative wine bars. The James Beard Foundation invited me to a young professionals event. But here's the thing about success: when your family doesn't believe in what you're doing, it feels incredibly lonely. I'd call home occasionally, and the conversations were always the same dance of politeness and disappointment. "How's your little project going?" my mom would ask, like I was still working on a science fair display instead of running a successful business. Dad would inquire about my backup plan, as if everything I'd built was just an elaborate delay before I came to my senses and got a real job. "It's good that you're learning about business," he'd say, "but when are you going to think about something more stable?" More stable. I was probably earning more than both my siblings combined, had built something from nothing, had created jobs for 15 people, but it wasn't stable because it didn't fit their definition of success. Avery had made partner at her law firm, something my parents celebrated with a dinner party and champagne toasts. Cole was managing investment portfolios worth millions, earning bonuses that they bragged about to their friends. And I was the one who dropped out to play with wine, even though what I'd built was probably more financially successful than either of their careers. The distance between us grew wider every month. I stopped calling as much because every conversation left me feeling defensive and misunderstood. They stopped asking detailed questions about my work because they genuinely didn't understand what I did or why it mattered. We all just pretended that everything was fine, that the fundamental disconnect between who they wanted me to be and who I actually was didn't create this enormous space between us that no one knew how to bridge. I threw myself into work, into making Barrel and Vine even better. I started offering wine education classes, teaching people about terroir and tasting techniques. I began hosting exclusive dinners, featuring small producers, creating experiences that you literally couldn't get anywhere else in the city. But late at night, when I was alone in the restaurant doing inventory or planning menus, I'd sometimes wonder what it would feel like to call my parents and share good news, to have them be proud of what I was building, instead of worried about my future. Then 3 weeks ago, my phone rang with my mom's number. "Riley, honey," she said, her voice carrying that particular brightness she used for special occasions. "We're planning something wonderful for your father's and my 30th anniversary." I could hear the excitement in her voice, the kind of happiness that comes from organizing something you know will be perfect. "We'd love for you to join us for dinner, somewhere really special. We've made reservations at this lovely new place we heard about through the Andersons. Barrel and Vine, I think it's called. They said it's absolutely wonderful, very sophisticated." The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. My own parents had made dinner reservations at my restaurant without knowing it was mine. They'd heard about my place through their social circle, decided it was good enough for their most important celebration, but had no idea their aimless son was the one who'd built it. "That sounds great, Mom," I managed to say, my voice somehow staying steady. "I'll definitely be there." "Wonderful. We're so excited to spend time with you. It's been too long since we've all been together, and this seemed like the perfect occasion." As I hung up the phone, I realized something fundamental had shifted inside me. For years, I'd been waiting for their approval, hoping they'd somehow see the value in what I was doing. believing that maybe someday they'd understand that I hadn't thrown my life away. I'd actually found it. But sitting in my office looking out at the restaurant I'd built from nothing, at the staff I'd hired and trained, at the customers who trusted me to create memorable experiences for them, I understood that I didn't need their validation anymore. I had something better than their approval. I had proof. So here I am, standing outside my own restaurant, watching my family through the window. They're already seated at the best table in the house, the one by the exposed brick wall that I personally restored. They have no idea they're sitting in my world. I chose my outfit carefully tonight. Dark jeans boots that have actually seen work, and this vintage leather jacket that I bought with my first real profit from the restaurant. To them, I probably look exactly like what they expect. Underdressed, unprofessional, still trying to figure my life out. If only they knew this jacket cost more than most people's rent. I take a deep breath and walk through the front door. The hostess Sarah gives me a subtle nod. She knows what's about to happen. The whole staff does. I briefed them earlier, told them to treat me like any other guest tonight. No special attention, no acknowledgement that I own the place. Riley, my mom's voice carries that tone of forced enthusiasm she uses when she's trying to make the best of a situation she's not entirely comfortable with. Dad stands up, gives me that firm handshake that's supposed to convey approval, but somehow always feels like a test. Good to see you, son. Avery hugs me and I can smell her expensive perfume, the kind that whispers rather than shouts. She's wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people make in a month. You look comfortable, she says with a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. Cole slaps my back in that way guys do when they're not sure what else to say. Little brother's still rocking the rebel look, I see. And there it is. The first dig of the evening delivered with a smile. You know me, I say, sliding into the chair they've left for me. Some things never change. Mom immediately jumps in with damage control. We're just so excited you could make it. It's been ages since we've all been together like this. Dad's looking around the restaurant with that expression he gets when he's trying to figure out if something meets his standards. Interesting place, he says. Very rustic. I love what they've done with the space, Avery adds, but I can hear the qualification in her voice. She's being polite, not genuine. Cole picks up his menu and grins. So, little brother, what line of work still keeps you in denim these days? The table goes quiet for just a moment. It's one of those questions that sounds casual, but cuts deep. They all know I dropped out of engineering school. They all know I threw away my education. But none of them have bothered to ask what I've been doing for the past 3 years. Oh, you know, I say, keeping my voice light. This and that. Staying busy. Mom jumps in again, trying to smooth things over. Riley's always been creative. Haven't you, honey? Creative. As if what I do is some kind of hobby, some artistic phase I'll eventually grow out of. The wine list here looks impressive, Dad says, clearly trying to change the subject. He's holding the leather-bound menu I designed myself, reading descriptions I wrote for wines I personally selected. They seem to really know what they're doing, Avery agrees. I watch them flip through pages of my work, my passion, my expertise, and talk about it like it's some mysterious craft they could never understand. The irony is almost too much to bear. Should we start with some appetizers? Mom suggests. I heard they do something special with barrel-aged cheeses. Cole laughs. Barrel-aged cheese that sounds like something right up Riley's alley. Remember when you were obsessed with that old barrel in the garage? The table chuckles, and I feel that familiar ache in my chest. They're laughing about the moment that changed my life, treating it like some childhood phase, some cute memory of their confused little brother. Yeah, I say quietly. I remember. What they don't know is that the barrel-aged cheese they're about to order was aged in barrels I restored myself. What they don't know is that every detail of this experience, from the lighting, to the music, to the way the tables are arranged, reflects choices I made. What they don't know is that their aimless son has built something extraordinary and they're sitting right in the middle of it. The first course arrives, and I have to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. It's our signature amuse-bouche barrel-aged brioche with a honey truffle that's been infused with wine from our oldest oak barrels. Sarah sets down the plates with practiced precision, and I watch my family's faces as they take in the presentation. It's elegant, unexpected, the kind of thing that makes people stop mid-conversation. Julien appears moments later with the wine pairing. He moves with that effortless grace that comes from decades of experience, presenting a glass to each of them like he's offering a small gift. For this evening's opening course, he says in that rich accent that commands attention, I've selected a 2019 Sancerre aged in American oak for 18 months. The minerality should complement the honey notes beautifully. My dad nods appreciatively. He's always been impressed by authority, and Julien radiates the kind of expertise that even my father respects. They taste the wine first, and I watch their expressions change. This isn't some random house selection. This is a wine I personally chose, aged in barrels I restored, paired with food that represents everything I've learned about flavor and craft. Avery takes a sip and pauses, her eyebrows raising slightly. Interesting choice, she says, but there's genuine surprise in her voice. It's much more complex than I expected. Interesting choice. If she only knew how many nights I spent perfecting that pairing, how many tastings we did to get the oak levels exactly right. Cole breaks into the brioche, and honey drips onto his plate in golden threads. He chews thoughtfully, his expression shifting from polite interest to something closer to genuine appreciation. Interesting texture, he says, taking another bite. There's something almost smoky about it. That would be the barrel aging, I think to myself. That would be the technique. I spent 2 years perfecting the process that most restaurants never bother with, because it takes patience and skill. Mom cuts her portion into precise pieces, always the perfectionist. This is quite good, she admits, though she sounds almost reluctant to give the compliment. Very sophisticated. Sophisticated. Coming from my mother, that's practically a rave review. Dad's being more analytical the way he approaches everything. The wine has excellent structure, he says, swirling his glass like he knows what he's talking about. Whoever selected this understands what they're doing. I take a bite of my own portion, tasting it as if for the first time. The bread is perfect, the crust crispy, but yielding the honey, adding sweetness that plays against the wine's mineral edge. It's a combination that took months to develop, and sitting here watching my family discover it feels surreal. The service here is impeccable, Avery observes, watching Sarah refill water glasses without being asked. They really seem to care about the details. That's what separates a good restaurant from a great one, Dad adds. Attention to detail, understanding that every element has to work together. He's describing my philosophy, exactly the approach I've built this entire place around. They're praising my vision, my execution, my team's dedication, and they have no idea. Cole reaches for more bread. I have to admit, when Mom said she'd made reservations at some wine bar I'd never heard of, I wasn't sure what to expect. But this is actually really impressive. Some wine bar I'd never heard of. The casual dismissal stings, but there's something else underneath it. Surprise. Respect. They're being forced to reconsider their assumptions, even if they don't realize why. Julien returns to check on the table, his presence commanding that particular kind of attention that master sommeliers always seem to draw. How are you finding the pairing? He asks, his eyes briefly meeting mine with the slightest hint of amusement. Exceptional, my father says, and I can hear the genuine appreciation in his voice. You clearly know your craft. Thank you, Julien replies graciously. It's always a pleasure to share something we're passionate about with people who can appreciate it. Passionate. There's that word again, the one my family has never associated with anything I do. As Julien moves away to attend to other tables, I notice my family's energy has shifted. They're more engaged now, more present. Good food and wine have a way of doing that, of breaking down barriers and opening people up to experiences they weren't expecting. But there's something bittersweet about watching them discover excellence in something I created while still thinking of me as the family member who can't get his life together. The irony is almost overwhelming. Here they are in my restaurant, praising my work, impressed by my standards, and completely oblivious to the fact that everything they're experiencing is a direct result of the path they told me would lead nowhere. The second course arrives, and with it the questions I've been dreading. It's our pan-seared duck breast with a wine reduction that took me 3 months to perfect, but all I can focus on is the way my mother's eyes are studying me across the table. "This place must be quite expensive," she says, cutting into her duck with surgical precision. "How are you managing to afford dinners like this?" Honey, there it is. The question that's really asking, how are you paying for anything when you don't have a real job? "I do okay," I say, keeping my voice neutral. Dad leans forward slightly, putting on his lawyer face. "Are you still doing that freelancing thing? The consulting work you mentioned last time we talked. Freelancing. Consulting." Those were the words I used to avoid explaining what I actually do because I knew they wouldn't understand. And now, they're coming back to haunt me. "Something like that," I manage. Avery exchanges a look with Cole that I'm not supposed to notice, but I do. It's that look siblings share when they're worried about the family screw-up. "Riley," Avery says gently, "we care about you. We just want to make sure you're stable." Stable. Another word that sounds supportive but feels like judgment. Cole takes a sip of wine and grins. That grin he's had since we were kids. The one that means he's about to say something he thinks is funny, but probably isn't. Well, at least we're here enjoying someone else's hard work instead of catering someone else's party, he says with a laugh. "Remember when you used to talk about opening your own restaurant? Thank God you figured out that was just a phase." The words hit me like a physical blow. A phase. Everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed, everything I've achieved, reduced to a childhood phase that I thankfully grew out of. Riley never actually wanted to open a restaurant. Mom says, her voice carrying that tone mothers use when they're correcting misconceptions about their children. "He just went through a period where he was interested in cooking. It was sweet, really." Sweet, Dad agrees. But completely impractical. Can you imagine Riley trying to run a business? He's too much of a dreamer. They're talking about me like I'm not sitting right here. Like I'm some abstract concept they need to explain to each other instead of a real person with real feelings. I can feel tears starting to build behind my eyes, and I hate myself for it. I hate that after all these years, after everything I've accomplished, they can still make me feel like that confused teenager in the garage. "The food industry is brutal," Avery adds, trying to be helpful. "The failure rate for restaurants is astronomical. Riley's much better off doing whatever he's doing now. Whatever I'm doing now." She literally has no idea what I do for a living, but she's confident it's better than pursuing my passion. Besides, Mom says, reaching across the table to pat my hand, "Someday you'll settle down. Find someone nice, maybe think about a family. All this wandering around will make more sense then." Someday I'll settle down. As if my entire adult life up until now has been some kind of extended adolescence, some period of confusion that I'll eventually grow out of. Dad chuckles and raises his glass. "To Riley," he says, "our free spirit, we love you just the way you are, son, even if we don't always understand you." They all laugh, and it's meant to be affectionate, meant to be inclusive. But sitting there listening to them laugh about my life like it's some charming quirk they have to tolerate, I feel something break inside me. I'm 27 years old. I own a successful restaurant. I employ 15 people. I've been featured in national publications. I have a waiting list for reservations that stretches months into the future. And my own family thinks I'm an aimless dreamer who needs to grow up and get a real job. The worst part is that part of me, some small part that I thought I'd eliminated years ago, still wants their approval, still wants them to be proud of me, still wants to be able to call them and share good news instead of deflecting their questions about my future. "You know what?" I say, quietly setting down my fork. "I need to use the restroom." I stand up before anyone can respond, before the tears that are threatening to spill actually make an appearance. I need a moment to collect myself, to remember who I am and what I've built, because in about 5 minutes, everything is going to change. I'm walking back from the restroom, having spent 5 minutes staring at myself in the mirror when I see Julian approaching their table with the main course. But this isn't just any service. He's carrying our most expensive bottles, the ones we reserve for special occasions. And he's moving with a kind of purpose that means something significant is about to happen. I stop in my tracks, suddenly understanding what he's about to do. We talked about this possibility weeks ago, but I never thought he'd actually follow through. Julian, in his infinite wisdom, has decided that enough is enough. My family is mid-conversation when he arrives at their table, and I watch from across the room as he sets down plates with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for heads of state. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian says, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that commands immediate attention. "I hope you're enjoying your evening at Barrel and Vine." "Oh, we absolutely are," my mother gushes. "Everything has been exceptional." "I'm delighted to hear that," Julian continues, and I can see him selecting his words carefully. "For your main course this evening, I've chosen something very special. Our dry-aged beef prepared with a wine reduction that uses grapes from my personal vineyard in Bordeaux." He begins opening the wine, and my family watches with the kind of rapt attention people give to master craftsmen. They have no idea what's coming. "This particular bottle," Julian says, holding up the wine so they can see the label, "was aged in barrels restored by our co-owner. It's a technique that very few people in America have mastered." "Co-owner?" Dad asks, suddenly interested. "How wonderful. Is he here tonight? We'd love to thank him for such an incredible experience." That's when Julian looks directly at me across the room. I can see the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, and I know there's no stopping what's about to happen. "Actually," Julian says, turning back to my family, "he is here tonight. In fact, he's been here the entire evening." The confusion on their faces is almost comical. I watch as they look around the restaurant, trying to figure out who Julian might be referring to. "I'm sorry," Avery says. "I don't understand." Julian gestures toward me, and suddenly every eye at the table follows his gaze. I'm standing there in my leather jacket and jeans, probably looking exactly like what they expect their disappointment of a son to look like. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. and Mrs. Harper," Julian says with perfect French formality. "But you are dining tonight at Barrel and Vine, and this is my co-owner Riley Harper, who has been your host this entire evening." The silence that follows is the kind that seems to stretch time itself. I watch my father's fork freeze halfway to his mouth. I see my mother's eyes widen in something that looks like shock. Avery's wine glass stops mid-sip, and Cole just stares at me like I'm some kind of optical illusion. "I'm sorry," Mom says finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you say co-owner?" "Majority owner, actually," Julian corrects gently. "Riley purchased my share of the business 18 months ago. He is now the primary proprietor of Barrel and Vine." I start walking toward the table, my heart pounding so hard I'm surprised they can't hear it. Every step feels like it's happening in slow motion, like I'm moving through water. "The wine you've been drinking," Julian continues as I approach, "was selected by Riley. The food you've been enjoying was prepared using techniques he developed. The barrels that aged tonight's cheese restored by his hands." Dad puts down his fork entirely, now his lawyer's mind clearly trying to process information that doesn't fit with his assumptions about his youngest son. "The sommelier who recommended this restaurant to your friends," Julian adds with just a hint of amusement. That would have been me speaking about Riley's establishment. I reach the table and stand there looking at 4 faces that are staring at me like they're seeing me for the first time. "Hello, family," I say quietly. "Welcome to my restaurant." The silence stretches for what feels like an eternity before my father finally speaks. "I don't understand," he says, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose entire worldview has just shifted. "You own this place." "I do," I say, simply sitting back down at the table. "I started as Julian's apprentice 3 years ago. He taught me everything about wine, about business, about what it means to create something authentic. 18 months ago, I bought him out. Mom is still staring at me like I'm speaking a foreign language. But you dropped out of engineering school. You said you were freelancing. I was freelancing, I explain. I was building this. Every day for 3 years, I was learning, growing, creating something I believed in. Cole shakes his head slowly. The barrel restoration, the wine knowledge, all those times you disappeared for weeks. I was in France learning from master vintners. I was traveling to vineyards, building relationships with growers. I was becoming good at something you never thought was worth pursuing. Avery is the first to recover, and when she looks at me, there's something different in her eyes. Something that looks like respect. Riley, she says quietly, this is incredible. This whole place, everything we've experienced tonight. You built this. Every detail, I confirm. The menu, the wine selection, the atmosphere. Even the tables were refinished by hand. Dad is processing this information the way he processes everything analytically, trying to fit new facts into his existing framework. The revenue projections, he starts, then stops himself. This must be quite profitable. It is, I say, more than I ever imagined when I started. There's another pause, and I can see them all recalibrating, trying to reconcile the son and brother they thought they knew with the person sitting in front of them. We had no idea, Mom says finally. Why didn't you tell us? Because every time I tried to explain what I was passionate about, you told me it was impractical. Every time I mentioned wine or restaurants or craftsmanship, you steered the conversation toward real careers and stable futures. The truth hangs in the air between us, and I can see them recognizing themselves in my words. We owe you an apology, Dad says, and his voice carries a weight I've never heard before. We clearly misjudged the situation. You misjudged me, I correct gently. And if we're going to move forward, some things need to change. Avery nods. What do you need from us? Respect, I say without hesitation. No more comments about finding direction or settling down. No more treating my work like a hobby I'll eventually outgrow. And definitely no asking for free meals or using our family connection to impress your friends. Cole actually laughs at that last part. Fair enough. God, Riley, I can't believe I made that joke about catering someone else's party. I'm such an idiot. Yes, you are. I agree, but I'm smiling when I say it. Mom reaches across the table and takes my hand. We're proud of you, she says, and for the first time in years, I believe her. What's next? Dad asks, and I can hear genuine curiosity in his voice, instead of concern. Are you thinking about expansion? Maybe, I say. But first I'm launching a barrel aging workshop next month, teaching other restaurateurs the techniques Julian taught me, passing on what I've learned. That sounds amazing, Avery says, and the enthusiasm in her voice is real. We finish dinner, and for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm having a conversation with my family instead of defending myself to them. They ask questions about the business, about my plans, about the challenges I've faced. Real questions, not the kind designed to point out what they see as flaws in my thinking. As the evening winds down, Julian approaches the table one final time. I hope you've enjoyed your introduction to what Riley has built, he says to my parents. He is quite remarkable, your son. We're beginning to understand that, Dad replies. I excuse myself to walk Julian through the wine cellar, something we do every evening to plan for the next day. As we move between the barrels checking temperatures and tasting samples, I glance back through the glass partition and see my family still sitting at the table. But they're not talking about me anymore. They're not shaking their heads or exchanging worried looks. They're simply enjoying the space I created, the wine I selected, the experience I designed. For the first time in my life, they're seeing me exactly as I am. Not as who they wanted me to be, not as someone who needed fixing or direction, but as someone who found his own path and built something extraordinary along the way. It turns out I was never aimless at all. I was just aiming at something they couldn't see yet. Tonight, finally, They can see it too. Sometimes the people who call you lost are the ones who've never had the courage to find their own path. Have you ever had to prove your worth to family who didn't believe in your dreams? Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of quiet triumph, hit that subscribe button for more real-life drama that'll keep you up at night.